Sometimes the deepest wounds in a man's heart can only be healed by the most unexpected friend. For 60-year-old Silas Boone, that friend came in the form of a desperate mother bear who would change his life forever. Living alone in his mountain cabin, Silas hasn't spoken to another soul since losing his son to war and his wife to grief. On a cold morning, he meets a wounded grizzly who does something no wild bear should ever do. She looks him in the eyes and begs for help. The mama bear whimpers and nudges toward the trees, pleading with him to follow. Something about her desperate gaze awakens feelings he thought were dead, against everything he knows about surviving. In the wilderness, Silas follows her. What he finds in that hidden den brings this tough mountain man to tears. But why would a wild bear trust a stranger with her babies? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn gold band on Silas Boone's weathered finger caught the first light of dawn as he reached for his coffee cup. 23 years he'd worn that ring, and Martha had been gone for 5 of them now. Still, every morning his thumb found its familiar groove, twisting the metal in a ritual that had become as automatic as breathing. The cabin around him held the silence like a living thing, thick, comfortable, and suffocating all at once. Outside, the Bitterroot Range stretched in every direction, peaks crowned with snow that never fully melted, even in the heart of summer. His one-room sanctuary sat perched on a rocky outcrop at 8,000 feet, accessible only by a treacherous trail that discouraged all but the most determined visitors. That was how Silas preferred it. The world below had taken everything that mattered to him, and he'd climbed high enough that it couldn't reach him anymore. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd once cared about details. Hand-hewn logs fitted with precision, a stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly, windows positioned to catch both sunrise and sunset. Martha had insisted on those windows during the planning stages, back when they dreamed of this place as a weekend retreat. "We'll need to see the mountains from our bed," she'd said, her eyes bright with possibility. Now the windows mostly gathered dust, their view wasted on a man who rarely looked beyond his own boots. Silas had built this refuge with his own hands during weekend trips, Jacob helping when the boy was old enough to swing a hammer without endangering his fingers. Those had been golden times, father and son working side by side, Martha packing elaborate picnic lunches that always included too much food and not enough napkins. Jacob would chatter constantly about everything and nothing, his voice echoing off the canyon walls like birdsong. The boy had inherited his mother's gift for finding wonder in simple things. The way moss grew in perfect spirals around tree trunks, how clouds cast shadows that looked like running horses, why some rocks sang when you struck them just right. The military had shaped Silas long before he became a husband and father. 22 years as an army medic, most of it spent in places where broken things needed fixing and broken people needed healing. He developed steady hands and a calm demeanor under pressure, skills that served him well in emergency rooms from Korea to Kosovo. But it was the quiet stretches between conflicts that had taught him the most valuable lessons, how to read the subtle signs of internal bleeding, when to trust his instincts over medical protocol, and that sometimes the best medicine was simply staying present with someone who was dying far from home. Those skills had made invaluable to his small Montana community after his discharge. Doc Patterson, the local veterinarian, had quickly recognized Silas's medical training and steady temperament. Before long, Silas was assisting with difficult births, setting broken bones on livestock, and performing emergency surgery on hunting dogs that had tangled with porcupines. The work felt natural to him. Animals didn't lie about their pain, didn't complicate healing with guilt or self-pity. They simply endured until they got better, or they didn single quotes T. Martha had been the nurse at the county medical clinic when they first met. She possessed a rare combination of clinical competence and genuine warmth that made her beloved by patients and colleagues alike. Her hands could start an IV on a dehydrated infant or comfort a grieving widow with equal skill. She'd taken one look at this quiet veteran with gentle eyes and decided he needed taking care of, whether he realized it or not. Their courtship had been slow and deliberate, like everything else in Silas's life. Sunday dinners that stretched into evening walks, fishing expeditions where more talking than casting took place, winter evenings spent reading by the fire while Martha knitted and Silas whittled small animals from pieces of pine. She taught him that love didn't have to be loud or complicated. It could be as simple as remembering how someone liked their coffee or knowing when they needed silence instead of words. Jacob's arrival had completed something in Silas that he hadn't realized was missing. The boy had Martha's curious nature and Silas's steady disposition, a combination that produced a child who could spend hours examining a butterfly's wings or helping his father repair a fence post with equal fascination. Silas taught him to track deer, identify edible plants, and read weather patterns in cloud formations. More importantly, he tried to pass on the harder lessons, that strength meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, that a man's word was his most valuable possession, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was ask for help. The war had taken Jacob on a Tuesday in October, 3 months into his second deployment. The knock on the door had come just as Martha was pulling an apple pie from the oven, the kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and butter. 2 uniformed officers stood on their porch, their faces carrying the weight of a message no parent should ever have to hear. Jacob had died instantly, they said, a roadside bomb that left no time for fear or pain. He'd been carrying medical supplies to a village clinic when it happened, trying to help people he'd never met in a place whose name Silas still couldn't pronounce correctly. Martha had crumbled like paper in rain. The woman who'd spent her career healing others couldn't find a way to heal herself. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped seeing the beauty in sunsets and spring flowers. The bottle started small, little something to help her sleep, something else to calm her nerves during the day. Silas watched helplessly as his wife disappeared bit by bit, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger who spoke to Jacob's ghost and forgot to feed herself. The night Martha died, alone in their bed while Silas dozed in his chair beside her, the silence that filled their house was different from any quiet he'd ever known. It wasn't the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other, or even the heavy silence of grief. It was the absolute absence of possibility, the end of all future conversations and shared memories. Silas had sat with her body until dawn, holding her cold hand and trying to remember the last time she'd smiled at him with recognition in her eyes. The funeral had been well attended, as befitted a woman who'd touched so many lives. Neighbors and former patients filled the small church, sharing stories of Martha's kindness and professional skill. But Silas had barely heard them. He stood beside Jacob's empty grave marker. The boy's body had never been recovered, and felt the weight of being the only one left to remember the sound of his son's laugh or the way Martha hummed while she cooked breakfast on Sunday mornings. The decision to move to the mountain cabin permanently hadn't been conscious so much as inevitable. The house in town held too many ghosts, too many reminders of conversations that would never happen again. Silas had sold everything except the absolute necessities and a few precious mementos, loading his truck with enough supplies to last through winter and driving up the winding mountain road for what he assumed would be the last time he'd need to interact with the outside world. That had been 5 years ago. 5 years of sunrise coffee and sunset whiskey, of chopping wood and tending a small garden, and speaking to no one except the occasional raven that perched on his porch railing. He'd developed routines that kept his body moving and his mind occupied, checking weather patterns on his battery-powered radio, maintaining his equipment, reading technical manuals by lamplight. The work was enough to fill his days, but not enough to fill the hollow spaces where purpose used to live. His neighbors, scattered though they were across the vast mountain landscape, had learned to respect his solitude. Old Henrik Peterson, whose ranch sprawled across the valley floor, left supplies at the base of the trail when harsh weather made travel dangerous. Sarah Chun, the forest ranger whose territory included Silas's remote outpost, checked on him annually but never pushed for conversation beyond confirming he was alive and well. They understood that some wounds required solitude to heal, even if the healing never seemed to come. The first aid kit that sat on his kitchen shelf had traveled with him from Korea to Kosovo to this isolated mountain peak. The medical supplies inside had been refreshed countless times over the years, but the olive green canvas case bore the marks of decades spent in field hospitals and makeshift clinics. It represented everything Silas had once been good at: fixing things, healing wounds, bringing comfort to creatures in pain. Now it mostly gathered dust, a relic from a time when his hands had purpose beyond maintaining his own survival. Some mornings, when the light hit the mountains just right and the air carried the scent of pine and possibility, Silas could almost remember what it felt like to believe in tomorrow. But those moments passed quickly, replaced by the familiar weight of routine and resignation. He'd made his peace with being a man whose best years were behind him, whose remaining days would be measured in small tasks and quiet endurance rather than love and laughter. The wedding ring caught the light again as he reached for his jacket, preparing for another day of solitude in a landscape vast enough to swallow all his regrets. He had no way of knowing that this particular morning would be different, that the trail ahead would lead him not deeper into isolation, but back toward the parts of himself he'd thought were buried forever, alongside his wife and son. The dog tags lay hidden beneath Jacob's old shirts in the cedar chest, but Silas could feel their weight from across the room as he laced his boots that morning. He'd learned not to look at them directly. The sight of his son's name stamped in metal had a way of stealing his breath and leaving him useless for hours. Instead, he focused on the routine: coffee, weather check, morning walk to inspect the perimeter of his small domain. The October air bit sharp and clean, carrying the promise of early snow. Frost painted delicate patterns on the cabin windows, and his breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the thin mountain atmosphere. This was the time of year when most sensible creatures began their preparations for winter, stockpiling food, seeking shelter, hunkering down for the long months ahead. Silas followed the same ancient rhythms, checking his firewood supply and inventorying his pantry with the methodical attention of a man who understood that carelessness at this altitude could be fatal. The trail that morning seemed different. Somehow, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Perhaps it was the unusual silence. Even the ever-present mountain jays had gone quiet, leaving only the crunch of frost-hardened leaves beneath his boots. The familiar path wound through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, past a small creek that would soon freeze solid. Around the rocky outcrop where he'd once found a family of mountain goats grazing in impossible defiance of gravity, it was. Near that same outcrop that he first heard the sound, a low rumbling moan that seemed to come from the earth itself. Silas stopped walking, every instinct from his military days suddenly alert. That wasn't the cry of any deer or elk he'd ever encountered. It was deeper, more resonant, carrying an emotional weight that made the hair on his neck stand upright. Following, the sound led him off the main trail, down a steep embankment thick with mountain mahogany and serviceberry bushes. His boots slipped on loose shale, and he had to grab onto branches to keep from sliding into the narrow ravine below. The moaning came again, closer now, and underneath it he could hear something else, a rhythmic scraping like claws against stone. The grizzly bear materialized from the shadows like something from a fever dream. She was massive, easily 400 pounds, her chocolate brown fur matted with blood along her left flank. 3 parallel gashes ran from her shoulder to her hip, deep enough that Silas could see pink flesh beneath the torn skin. A mountain lion most likely, though what had driven a cat to attack something this size was beyond his understanding. What stopped him cold wasn't the bear's size, or her wounds, it was her eyes. Instead of the flat, predatory stare he expected, the grizzly looked directly at him with an expression he'd seen too many times in field hospitals. Pain, yes, but beneath that was something far more complex. Desperation, pleading, the same look Martha had worn near the end, when the pain medication couldn't touch the deeper hurt, and she'd needed him to understand things she couldn't put into words. The bear made no move to attack. Instead, she took a careful step toward him, favoring her injured side, and released a sound unlike anything in his experience with wildlife. It was almost conversational, a low whimpering that rose and fell like spoken language. She paused, watching his face intently, then turned toward a stand of dense spruce trees and made the sound again. Every piece of mountain wisdom Silas had accumulated over 5 decades screamed at him to back away slowly, to give the injured animal space to retreat without feeling cornered. Wounded predators were unpredictable at best, lethal at worst. The rational part of his mind cataloged escape routes and calculated his chances of reaching the main trail before the bear decided. He represented a threat, but something deeper than logic held him in place. The bear's behavior defied everything he thought he knew about wildlife. She wasn't displaying aggression or territorial posturing. If anything, her body language reminded him of Martha trying to show him something important in Jacob's room after. The boy had left for basic training, urgent, purposeful, desperate to communicate something words couldn't express. The grizzly took another step toward the trees, then looked back at him with those impossibly expressive eyes. When he didn't follow, she repeated the whimpering sound and nudged her massive head toward the spruce grove. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly communicative, that Silas found himself taking a step forward before his conscious mind caught up with his body. "What is it, girl?" The words came out as a whisper, the first he'd spoken aloud in weeks. His voice sounded foreign in the mountain silence, rough from disuse but steadier than he'd expected. The bear's ears pricked at the sound, and she released what could only be described as a sigh of relief. She led him deeper into the trees, moving slowly to accommodate her injuries and frequently checking to make sure he was following. The forest floor was thick with fallen needles that muffled their footsteps, and shafts of sunlight created a cathedral-like atmosphere among the towering trunks. Silas kept a safe distance but found himself oddly unafraid. There was something about the bear's manner that spoke of intelligence and purpose rather than wild instinct. The den was hidden so perfectly that he might have walked past it a dozen times without noticing. A natural depression between 2 massive granite boulders, partially roofed by a fallen log and camouflaged by years of accumulated forest debris. But it was what lay inside that drove every other thought from his mind. 2 cubs, neither more than 6 months old, lay trapped beneath a pine tree that had fallen across the den's entrance. The smaller one was unconscious, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The larger cub was awake, but clearly in distress, his back legs pinned beneath the trunk in a way that suggested serious injury. The mother bear's story became clear in an instant. She'd been away foraging when the tree fell, probably weakened by recent winds and finally brought down by its own weight. Returning to find her babies trapped, she'd attempted to move the obstacle herself, sustaining the claw marks from a territorial dispute with some other predator drawn by the sounds of distress. Now, exhausted and injured, she'd done something unprecedented in the wild. She'd sought help from a human. Silas dropped to his knees beside the fallen tree, his mind automatically shifting into the clinical assessment mode that had served him. in countless emergency situations. The pine was substantial, probably 8 inches in diameter and at least 12 feet long. Too heavy for one man to lift, but not impossible to lever if he could find the right fulcrum point, and something to use as a pry bar. The conscious cub whimpered when he saw Silas approaching, but the mother bear moved between them and made a series of soft chuffing sounds that seemed to calm her baby. She was telling the little one that this strange, upright creature was here to help. Silas realized the intelligence behind that behavior was staggering. "Easy now," he murmured, as much to himself as to the bears. "Let me see what we're dealing with here." The adrenaline hit him as he began examining the situation, the same focused clarity he'd felt countless times when lives hung in the balance. This was familiar territory, a problem to solve. Creatures in pain who needed his help. Skills he thought were useless finally finding purpose again. For the first time in 5 years, Silas Boone had something important to do. The mother bear settled beside her trapped cubs and fixed her gaze on him with absolute trust. In her eyes, he saw an echo of every parent who'd ever brought a broken child to him for healing. Every desperate soul who'd believed he could fix what seemed irreparably damaged. The weight of that trust was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where his heart had been dormant for so long, Silas felt something stir to life. The hand-carved wooden toy sat in a dusty corner of the cabin's main room, forgotten relics from a time when laughter had echoed off these walls. A small horse with a flowing mane, a bear standing on its hind legs, a set of alphabet blocks worn smooth by small fingers, all crafted during long winter evenings when Jacob had been small enough to believe his father could make anything wonderful. From a simple piece of pine, Silas hadn't looked at them in years, but as he worked to construct a makeshift stretcher from fallen branches and his spare jacket, the memory of carving each toy flooded back with startling clarity. How Jacob's eyes had lit up when presented with a new creation. How the boy had insisted on helping sand each piece until it was perfectly smooth. How Martha had lined them up on the mantel like precious sculptures rather than simple playthings. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now using those same woodworking skills to save another family, another set of cubs who needed protection and care. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, lashing branches together with paracord from his emergency kit, creating a platform stable enough to transport injured animals without causing additional harm. The larger cub had suffered a fractured hind leg, not life-threatening, but serious enough to require careful handling. The smaller one seemed to be suffering from shock and dehydration more than physical trauma, though a nasty scrape along her ribs suggested she'd been grazed by the falling tree. Both cubs were weak from their ordeal, their normal cub energy replaced by the listless behavior of creatures pushed beyond their limits. Moving the fallen pine had taken every ounce of strength Silas possessed. Using a sturdy branch as a lever and a strategic boulder as a fulcrum point, he'd managed to raise the trunk just enough for the mother bear to drag her babies free. The moment when those tiny bodies emerged from beneath the crushing weight had brought tears to his eyes. The first he'd shed since Martha's funeral. The trek back to his cabin required 3 separate trips. First, the injured cubs, carried gently on his improvised stretcher while their mother limped alongside, never more than a few feet from her babies. Then a return journey to gather pine boughs and other materials to construct temporary shelter. Finally, a supply run to retrieve his first aid kit and what veterinary supplies he'd accumulated over the years. The mother bear, he begun thinking of her as Mama. Though he was careful not to say the name, aloud showed remarkable understanding of his intentions. She allowed him to examine her wounds, standing perfectly still while he cleaned the claw marks with antiseptic and applied bandages made from torn bed sheets. The injuries were deep but clean and showed no signs of infection. With proper care, they would heal completely. Setting up the bear family in his cabin's lean-to storage area, felt both natural and surreal. The space was large enough to accommodate all three bears while providing protection from the elements, but close enough to the main cabin that Silas could monitor their condition easily. He lined the floor with pine boughs and old blankets, creating a nest that approximated the comfort of their original den. The cubs' needs reminded him powerfully of caring for an infant Jacob during those sleep-deprived early months of parenthood. They required feeding every few hours, constant monitoring for signs of distress, and the kind of patient attention that could only come from someone who genuinely cared about their welfare. Silas found himself checking on them throughout the night, just as he'd once crept into Jacob's nursery to ensure his son was still breathing. Preparing food for bear cubs proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. His research from years of assisting Doc Patterson suggested a diet of fish, berries, and nuts, supplemented with the occasional small mammal. But with winter approaching and natural food sources becoming scarce, he'd have to be creative. Canned salmon, mixed with oatmeal, became their primary sustenance, enriched with honey and whatever berries he could forage from the surrounding slopes. The larger cub, the male, showed a personality remarkably similar to young Jacob's fearless curiosity. Despite his injured leg, he constantly attempted to explore beyond the confines of their temporary shelter, investigating every new sight and smell with the intensity of a born adventurer. Silas found himself smiling as he gently redirected these expeditions, remembering how many times he'd performed similar maneuvers with his own adventurous son. The smaller cub, clearly female, possessed a more cautious nature that reminded him of Martha's thoughtful approach to new situations. She would observe carefully before acting, testing each new experience for safety before fully committing. When Silas offered food, she would watch her brother eat first, then approach with deliberate steps that spoke of intelligence beyond her months. Mama remained the most complex member of their unusual family. Her behavior suggested a level of understanding that challenged everything Silas thought he knew about wildlife intelligence. She seemed to recognize that the cubs needed medical attention beyond what she could provide, and she actively facilitated Silas's care efforts. When he needed to examine an injury or administer medication, she would position herself where the cubs could see her, offering reassurance through soft chuffing sounds and gentle nuzzles. The first time Silas spoke directly to the bears, the words felt foreign on his tongue. "Easy now, little one," he murmured while cleaning the female cub's wounded ribs. "This might sting a bit, but it'll help you heal." The cub stopped squirming at the sound of his voice, fixing him with dark eyes that seemed far too wise for such a small creature. Mama's response to his words was even more remarkable. She made a sound deep in her throat, not quite a purr, but something warm and approving that seemed to acknowledge his gentleness with her babies. It was the first positive response to his voice that Silas had received from any living creature. In years, as the days settled into routine, Silas began talking to the bears more frequently. He explained what he was doing as he changed bandages or prepared food, described the weather patterns visible from his windows, even shared snippets of his daily thoughts. The bears listened with apparent interest, their ears tracking his movements, and their eyes following his face as if they understood far more than seemed possible. The conversations weren't entirely one-sided. Mama had developed a vocabulary of sounds that seemed to correspond to different needs or emotions. A low rumble meant contentment. Sharp huffs indicated concern about the cubs, and a particular whimpering sound had learned meant she was asking him to check on something specific. The cubs were learning to communicate as well, their baby vocalizations becoming more distinct as they grew stronger. Working with his hands again, fashioning feeding dishes from carved wood, constructing toys to keep the cubs occupied, building improvements to their shelter awakened skills and satisfactions Silas had almost forgotten. Each small project reminded him of countless similar tasks he'd performed for Jacob, the quiet pleasure of creating something useful with nothing but time and attention. But it was the simple act of being needed that affected him most profoundly. For 5 years, his days had been measured only by his own survival, his own minimal needs. Now he had 3 lives depending on his knowledge and care, creatures who looked to him for healing and protection. The responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating, like stepping back into a version of himself he'd thought was permanently lost. Martha's recipe book lay open on the kitchen counter, its pages yellowed with age and stained with memories of countless family meals. Silas hadn't touched it since the week after a funeral, when well-meaning neighbors had suggested he might want to cook something familiar to comfort himself. But now, faced with the challenge of feeding a recovering bear family, he found himself turning to his late wife's careful handwriting for guidance. Her notes filled the margins of every recipe. Jacob loves extra cinnamon. Double the portions. When Henrik visits, use less salt for Mama's blood pressure. Each annotation was a small window into the life they'd shared, the attention she'd paid to making everyone feel cared for through the simple act of feeding them well. Martha had believed that the love could be expressed through a perfectly seasoned stew or a batch of cookies warm from the oven. And looking at her careful instructions now, Silas realized she'd been right. The bear's nutritional needs were different from human family dinners, but the principle remained the same. Food was medicine, comfort, and communication, all wrapped into one essential act of care. Silas began adapting Martha's techniques to his unusual household, mixing oatmeal with canned salmon the way she'd once combined oats with berries for Jacob's breakfast, adding honey with the same careful attention she'd used when sweetening his coffee. The male cub Silas had begun thinking of him as Charlie, after the phonetic alphabet designation his unit had used for dangerous situations showed an appetite that reminded him powerfully of Jacob at the same age. Everything was approached with enthusiasm and curiosity, from new foods to unfamiliar sounds. Charlie would attack each meal with the focused intensity of a creature who understood that growth required fuel, pausing only to share encouraging looks with his sister. The female cub possessed Martha's more cautious approach to new experiences. She would observe Charlie's reaction to each offering before deciding whether to participate, testing each bite carefully before committing to a full meal. Silas had begun calling her Belle in his mind, thinking of how Martha had always spoken, of the beauty she found in careful consideration, and taking time to truly appreciate each moment, watching them eat together as a family stirred memories that had been buried for years. Sunday morning breakfasts, when Jacob would chatter excitedly about his plans for the day, while Martha listened with the patient attention she brought to everything their son found important. The way she'd cut his pancakes into perfect squares, knowing he preferred them that way even though he'd never specifically requested it. How Jacob would save the last bite of everything to share with whichever parent happened to be sitting closest, his generous nature evident even at 5 years old. The similarities between past and present were both comforting and heartbreaking. Charlie's habit of checking to make sure Belle got her fair share of the best portions echoed Jacob's childhood insistence that Martha always received the largest strawberry or the prettiest flower. Belle's gentle nudges when Charlie ate too quickly reminded him of Martha's subtle ways of moderating their son's more impulsive tendencies without dampening his enthusiasm. Mama's role in these family dynamics fascinated Silas most of all. She possessed Martha's gift for managing personalities and maintaining harmony without obvious effort. When Charlie grew too boisterous in his play, a soft chuff from his mother would remind him to be mindful of his injured leg. When Belle seemed overwhelmed by new experiences, Mama would position herself as a calming presence, offering wordless reassurance through proximity and gentle contact. The first time Silas laughed in their presence, the sound startled him more than it did the bears. Charlie had been attempting to investigate a butterfly that had wandered into their shelter. His earnest stalking technique, undermined by his splinted leg, and general lack of coordination. The sight of this determined predator being consistently outwitted by an insect struck Silas as irresistibly funny, and before he could stop himself, he was chuckling at the absurd tableau. All three bears turned to look at him, their expressions so comically surprised that his chuckle became a full laugh, the first genuine laughter he'd experienced since before Martha's decline. The sound felt rusty and foreign, like an instrument that hadn't been played in years, but underneath the strangeness was a warmth he'd forgotten existed. Mama's response to his laughter was extraordinary. She made a sound he'd never heard from her before, a low rumbling that seemed to emanate from deep in her chest. It took him a moment to realize she was mimicking his emotional state, offering her own version of amusement at her son's antics. The cubs quickly joined in with their own baby sounds, creating a chorus of contentment that filled the shelter with life. That evening, as Silas prepared their dinner, he found himself humming while he worked. It was an old song Martha had favored, something she'd sung while cooking Sunday dinners or tending her garden. He hadn't realized he was making any sound until Mama lifted her head and listened intently, her ears forward with apparent interest. When he stopped, embarrassed by his unconscious breach of the silence he'd maintained for years, she made a soft questioning sound that seemed to ask why the pleasant noise had ended. "You like that, do you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. In response, Mama settled more comfortably and fixed him with an expectant gaze. Tentatively, Silas resumed humming, watching as all three bears relaxed into attitudes of peaceful attention. Music, apparently, was another universal language. The complications began subtly. Other wildlife had started showing unusual interest. In his remote cabin, drawn by scents and sounds that didn't belong in the mountain ecosystem, Silas noticed fresh tracks around his property fox, coyote, and what looked like mountain lion prints. Nothing overtly threatening, but a reminder that his unusual house guests were disrupting the natural order in ways that could attract unwanted attention. More concerning were the changes he observed in his own behavior. He began talking to the bears constantly, sharing thoughts and observations he'd kept locked inside for years. His sleep patterns had shifted to accommodate their needs, and he caught himself planning activities around their comfort and entertainment. The emotional walls he'd constructed so carefully were developing cracks, letting in feelings he'd worked hard to bury. The attachment growing between them felt both natural and dangerous. These were wild animals, not domestic pets, and eventually, they would need to return to their natural habitat. But watching Charlie's leg grow stronger each day, seeing Belle's confidence increase as she explored her expanding world, observing Mama's trust in his continued care, all of it was awakening parts of himself he'd thought were permanently lost as he cleaned up after their evening meal. Silas caught his reflection in the darkened window and was surprised by what he saw. The man looking back at him still bore the marks of grief and isolation, but something had changed around the eyes. There was purpose there, and something that might have been hope, fragile as winter ice, but undeniably present. For the first time in years, tomorrow held the promise of something more than mere survival. The military compass had guided Silas through hostile territory in 3 different wars, its steady needle always pointing toward magnetic north, regardless of weather, terrain, or the chaos erupting around him. Now it sat on his kitchen table, its brass surface tarnished but its moral weight heavier than ever. For the first time in years, Silas found himself questioning which direction was truly north, the path of legal obligation or the road of compassionate necessity. The sound of Sarah Chun's ATV echoing up the mountain trail came 3 weeks after he'd taken in the bear family. Her annual welfare check was as predictable as the changing seasons, and usually, Silas appreciated her respectful approach to his privacy. But this year, the ranger's visit filled him with the kind of anxiety he hadn't experienced since lying to superior officers about classified mission details. He had perhaps 10 minutes before she reached the cabin, enough time to move the bears to the back shelter he'd hastily constructed for exactly this purpose, but not enough to eliminate all traces of their presence. Charlie and Belle had grown considerably since their rescue, their playful energy leaving evidence throughout his previously pristine living space. Scratches on wooden surfaces, disturbed furniture arrangements, and the lingering scent of wild animals would be obvious to anyone trained in wildlife management. "Stay quiet now," he whispered to Mama as he guided the family toward their hiding place. The mother bear seemed to understand the urgency in his voice, gathering her cubs with efficient maternal authority and leading them toward the concealed shelter. But her dark eyes held a question that made Silas's chest tighten. She trusted him completely, and that trust was about to be tested in ways that could endanger them all. Sarah's approach was announced by the crunch of boots on frosted leaves and the jingle of equipment on her utility belt. She was a competent ranger in her early 40s, someone who'd earned her position through genuine expertise rather than political connections. Her annual visits followed a comfortable pattern coffee, weather discussion, equipment inventory, and respectful departure. This year would need to appear no different, despite the revolutionary changes in Silas's daily life. "Morning, Silas," she called from the porch, her voice carrying the familiar tone of friendly professionalism. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. Just doing my annual check to make sure the mountain hasn't swallowed you whole." "Come in," he replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Coffee's fresh if you're interested." Sarah entered with the observant efficiency of someone trained to assess situations quickly. Her eyes swept the cabin's interior, noting changes that might indicate problems or concerns. Silas watched her gaze linger on the larger-than-usual pile of firewood beside the stove, the extra food supplies visible through his partially open pantry, and the subtle disarray that suggested the space was being used more actively than usual. "You've been busy," she observed, accepting the offered coffee cup. "Place looks more lived in than I've seen it in years." "That's good, means you're taking care of yourself." The irony of her comment wasn't lost on him. He was indeed taking better care of himself, but only because he was responsible for taking care of others. "Winter prep," he said simply, hoping the explanation would satisfy her curiosity. Their conversation followed familiar patterns, weather predictions, trail conditions, any unusual wildlife activity in the area. It was this last topic that made Silas's palms sweat despite the cool morning air. Sarah was responsible for monitoring the health and behavior of the region's wildlife population, and any significant changes fell under her jurisdiction. "Speaking of wildlife," she said, pulling out a small notebook, "we've had some interesting reports from the lower elevations. Hikers mentioning increased bear activity, tracks in unusual locations, some aggressive behavior that doesn't match normal patterns. You notice anything up here?" The moment stretched between them like a taut wire. Silas could feel the weight of his compass on the table beside him, its needle pointing steadily north while his moral compass spun wildly between competing directions. The truth would protect him legally, but doom the bear family to separation and captivity. A lie would violate everything he'd been taught about integrity, but preserve the unlikely family he'd grown to love. "Haven't seen much," he said finally, the words tasting like copper in his mouth. "Few tracks near the creek, but nothing out of ordinary for this time of year." Sarah nodded, making notes in her precise handwriting. "Makes sense. Your elevation probably keeps you above most of the typical foraging patterns." She paused, studying his face with the attention of someone trained to read people as well as landscapes. "You doing okay up here, Silas? You seem, different somehow. More alert, maybe. More present." The observation hit closer to home than he was comfortable with. Sarah possessed Martha's gift for seeing beneath surface appearances, and her professional training made her particularly skilled at identifying behavioral changes. "Just the season," he deflected. Always get more focused when winter approaches. From the direction of the concealed shelter came the faintest sound, Charlie's distinctive whimper when he wanted his mother's attention. It was barely audible, no louder than wind in the pine boughs, but Sarah's head turned slightly toward the noise. Silas felt his heart rate spike as he fought to maintain his expression of casual unconcern. "Wind's picking up," he said, moving toward the window in a deliberate attempt to draw her attention away from the shelter. "Storm system moving in from the west, according to the radio." Sarah joined him at the window, her professional interest in weather patterns temporarily overriding her curiosity about mysterious sounds. They discussed cloud formations and precipitation predictions while Silas silently prayed that his unusual household would remain quiet until she departed. The remainder of her visit passed without incident, but Silas couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah suspected something was different about his situation. Her questions were more probing than usual, her observations more detailed, and her departure seemed reluctant rather than routine. As her TV's engine faded into the distance, he felt the weight of moral compromise settling on his shoulders. Like a lead blanket, Mama emerged from hiding with her cubs close behind, her intelligent eyes reading his emotional state with uncomfortable accuracy. She approached him slowly, her massive head lowering until she could look directly into his face. The trust in her gaze was absolute, but underneath it he sensed a question about the strange tension that had filled their shared space. "It's complicated," he told her, his voice heavy with implications she couldn't possibly understand. "Humans have rules about wild animals, laws that don't account for situations like this. What we're doing here, it's not legal, even if it's right." The words hung in the air between them, a confession that changed nothing and everything simultaneously. Silas had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, made a choice that put him at odds with the legal system he'd spent his military career defending. The compass on his table still pointed north, but he was no longer certain which direction represented true moral ground. As Charlie and Belle resumed their play around his feet, their innocent energy a stark contrast to the adult complications. Swirling around them, Silas realized he'd passed a point of no return. Whatever consequences awaited him, he couldn't imagine abandoning this family he'd helped heal. They had saved him as much as he'd saved them, and some obligations transcended legal boundaries. The compass gleamed in the afternoon light, its needle steady and sure, pointing toward a magnetic north that had nothing to do with the moral territory he now occupied. Martha's knitted scarf hung on the peg beside the door where she'd left it 5 years ago, its soft blue wool still holding the faint scent of her lavender soap. Silas had never moved it, couldn't bring himself to pack it away with her other belongings. Now, as he wrapped it around his neck against the bitter morning cold, he felt her presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him, offering the same quiet comfort she'd provided throughout their marriage. The November storms had arrived with unusual fury, dropping 2 feet of snow in as many days and bringing temperatures that made survival a daily challenge rather than a seasonal inconvenience. The Bear family shelter, adequate for autumn weather, now required constant attention to maintain livable conditions. Silas found himself working 18-hour days, shoveling between his cabin and their quarters with hot water bottles, additional insulation, and the steady supply of high-calorie food they needed to maintain body heat. Charlie had grown remarkably. During his recovery, his injured leg now fully functional, and his energy seemingly unlimited despite the harsh conditions. He approached each new challenge with the fearless enthusiasm that reminded Silas so powerfully of Jacob's childhood adventures. Building snow forts, investigating ice formations, attempting to catch snowflakes with his tongue every winter. Phenomenon was a source of wonder that demanded immediate and thorough investigation. Belle had developed into a thoughtful observer of her expanding world, her cautious nature evolving into something more akin to scientific curiosity. She would study Silas's daily routines with the intensity of a researcher, learning to anticipate his needs and occasionally offering assistance in her own limited way. When he struggled to carry supplies through deep snow, she would clear a path with her strong paws. When Charlie's exuberance led him into minor difficulties, she would alert Silas with specific vocalizations that he'd learned to interpret. But it was Mama's behavior that touched him most deeply. The massive grizzly had begun bringing him gifts stones from the creek bed, interesting pieces of wood, even a perfectly preserved bird's nest she'd somehow retrieved without damaging its delicate construction. At first he dismissed these offerings as coincidence, but their frequency and the deliberate way she presented them made their intentional nature undeniable. The gifts reminded him of Jacob's childhood habit of collecting treasures for his parents' unusual rocks, pressed flowers, small toys won at county fairs. "Look what I found for you, Dad," the boy would say, his face shining with the joy of giving. Mama's presentations carried that same energy, the same desire to share beauty and wonder with someone she cared about. Henrik Peterson's surprise visit came on a day when the storm had temporarily exhausted itself, leaving behind crystalline air and snow that sparkled like ground diamonds. The old rancher's arrival was announced by the distant growl of his snowmobile, a sound that sent Silas into the now familiar panic of concealing his unusual household. But this time, the routine was complicated by Charlie's determination to investigate the interesting noise approaching their territory. "No, boy," Silas whispered urgently, trying to guide the curious cub toward the shelter. "You need to stay hidden." Charlie, however, had reached the age where his natural confidence was beginning to override his learned caution. The approaching engine represented the most exciting development in his young life, and no amount of human insistence was going to prevent him from conducting a proper investigation. He slipped past Silas's reaching hands and bounded toward the front of the cabin with the enthusiasm of a creature who'd never encountered anything he couldn't handle. Henrik's snowmobile crested the final rise just as Charlie rounded the corner of the cabin, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, man and bear cub regarded each other with mutual surprise. Henrik, 73 years old and wise in the ways of mountain wildlife, recognized immediately that he was looking at an impossibility: a healthy grizzly cub in November, alone and unafraid, behaving more like a domestic animal than a wild predator. "Well, I'll be damned," Henrik said softly, shutting off his engine but making no sudden movements. "Silas, you want to explain what's going on here?" There was no point in denial or deflection. Charlie's presence was evidence enough that Silas's life had taken directions that defied both law and common sense. With a resignation that felt oddly liberating, he emerged from behind the cabin with Mama and Belle following close behind, their family unit complete and undeniable. Henrik's weathered face cycled through surprise, concern, and finally something that might have been admiration. He'd spent his entire life working with animals, and he possessed the rancher's practical understanding that sometimes survival required bending rules that were written by people who'd never faced life or death decisions in isolated places. "How long?" Henrik asked simply. 6 weeks, Silas replied. "Found them trapped under a fallen tree. Mama was hurt. Cubs would have died without help." Henrik nodded slowly, his experienced eyes taking in the obvious health and contentment of all 3 bears. Charlie, emboldened by the lack of threatening behavior from the stranger, had begun investigating the snowmobile with typical cub thoroughness. Belle remained close to her mother, but showed none of the fear that should have characterized a wild animal's response to human presence. "They look good," Henrik observed. "Better than good. They look like family." The word hung in the cold air between them, carrying implications that both men understood perfectly. Silas had crossed the line from wildlife rescue into something far more complex and legally problematic. These bears weren't temporary patients recovering from injury. They were family members who'd found their place in his daily life as naturally as if they'd always belonged there. "What are you going to do come spring?" Henrik asked, his question carrying the weight of practical reality. Cubs this age, they'll be ready for independence, but they've learned to trust humans. That's dangerous for them and for any people they encounter later. It was the question that kept Silas awake at night, the inevitable reckoning that approached with each passing day. Charlie and Belle were growing stronger and more confident, but their education had been shaped by human care rather than wild experience. They knew nothing of hunting, hibernation cycles, or the healthy fear of humans that kept wild bears alive in a world increasingly crowded with people. "I don't know," Silas admitted, the honesty feeling like another step away from the careful control he'd maintained for years. "I know what I should do, what the law requires. But when you look at them, you see family," Henrik finished quietly. "I understand that, son. Lost my share of family over the years. Sometimes love shows up in unexpected packages." The old rancher's acceptance felt like absolution and burden simultaneously. Henrik wouldn't report him. That much was clear from his tone and manner. But his visit had forced Silas to confront the approaching crisis that winter's end would bring. Every day that passed strengthened the bonds between them, making the eventual separation more emotionally devastating while simultaneously making it more necessary for the bear's long-term survival. That evening, as he wrapped Martha's scarf more tightly around his neck and watched his unlikely family settle in for another night, Silas realized he was living borrowed time. The love that had saved him was the same love that would ultimately require him to make the hardest choice of his life. Jacob's final letter lay exactly where Martha had placed it 5 years ago, tucked behind a photograph in her jewelry box, unopened and forgotten in the chaos of grief that had followed the military chaplain's visit. Silas discovered it while searching for additional warm clothing that might be modified into bedding for the bears, his hands shaking as he recognized his son's careful handwriting on the envelope, marked "For Dad, to be opened when you're ready to forgive yourself." The letter had been written 3 days before Jacob's death, according to the postmark, but it had arrived a week after the funeral when Silas was incapable of processing anything beyond the immediate requirements of burial and paperwork. Martha had set it aside, promising they would read it together when the raw edge of loss had dulled enough to allow for deeper reflection. But Martha's own decline had accelerated so quickly that the letter became another casualty of their shared devastation. Forgotten until this moment when fate placed it in his hands, the envelope trembled between his fingers as he carried it to the kitchen table, Charlie and Belle watching from their comfortable positions near the fire. Even Mama seemed to sense the significance of this discovery, her dark eyes fixed on Silas with the intensity she usually reserved for protecting her cubs. The letter felt impossibly heavy for something made of paper, as if all the conversations he'd never had with his son had been compressed into a few sheets of military stationery. Opening it required more courage than he'd needed to face enemy fire or hold Martha's hand as she slipped away from him. The seal came apart reluctantly, as if even the adhesive understood the magnitude of what lay hidden inside. Jacob's handwriting filled 3 pages, the familiar loops and angles bringing his voice back so clearly that Silas could almost hear his son speaking the words aloud. "Dad," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me over here, and I need you to know some things that I was too proud or too scared to say while I had the chance. I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation, about the things we said to each other before I deployed, and I realize I never gave you the chance to understand why I had to come here." The memory of that final argument hit Silas like a physical blow. Jacob, 22 years old and burning with righteous purpose, insisting that he owed a debt to his country that could only be paid through military service. Silas, terrified, by the prospect of losing his only child to a war he didn't fully understand, demanding that Jacob consider his obligations to family before rushing off to prove his courage in foreign deserts. "You are right about a lot of things," the letter continued. "War is uglier and more complicated than anything they show you in training. People die for reasons that don't make sense, and sometimes the only choice you have is between bad and worse. But you were wrong about why I needed to be here. It wasn't about proving myself or living up to some idea of what makes a man. It was about understanding what you went through, what shaped you into the father who taught me that strength means protecting people who can't protect themselves." Silas's vision blurred as he read his son's words, each sentence reframing memories he'd carried like stones in his chest for 5 years. He'd convinced himself that Jacob's deployment was rebellion against parental wisdom, a young man's rejection of older and wiser counsel. The possibility that his son had been trying to bridge the gap between their experiences rather than escape from parental influence had never occurred to him. "I know you blame yourself for not talking me out of enlisting," Jacob wrote. "Mom told me about the nightmares you still have, about the friends you lost in Korea and later conflicts. You tried so hard to protect me from understanding the weight you carry, but that protection made it impossible for me to help carry some of that load. Coming here, seeing what you saw, experiencing what shaped you, it's the only way I could really know my father." The accusation Silas had carried for years that his failure to dissuade Jacob from military service had directly caused his son's death crumbled under the weight of this new understanding. Jacob hadn't enlisted despite his father's experience, but because of it, seeking connection rather than distance, trying to build a bridge across the generational divide that separated their experiences. "By the time you read this," the letter continued, "you'll probably be convinced that you failed me somehow, that you should have done something different to keep me safe. Dad, I need you to understand something. You gave me everything I needed to be a good man and a good soldier. The courage you taught me, the integrity you modeled, the compassion you showed to everyone who needed healing. Those gifts are what make this deployment meaningful instead of just dangerous." Charlie had wandered over to investigate the emotional disturbance his human was experiencing, his warm bulk pressing against Silas's leg in a gesture of comfort that reminded him powerfully of Jacob's childhood habit of offering wordless support during difficult moments. The cub's presence grounded him enough to continue reading, though each paragraph felt like emotional surgery performed without anesthesia. "I know you're probably wondering if I'm scared," Jacob had written. "Of course I am, but I'm not scared of dying. Dad, I'm scared of dying without you knowing how proud I am to be your son, how grateful I am for every lesson you taught me about what it means to care for others. When I see wounded civilians or help evacuate injured soldiers, I'm using skills you gave me. When I stay calm under pressure or make decisions based on protecting the innocent, I'm following examples you set." The revelation that his son had carried forward, lessons from his father's medical training and moral example, rather than rejecting them as outdated military baggage, fundamentally altered Silas's understanding of their relationship. He'd been so focused on protecting Jacob from the darker aspects of his own experience that he'd failed to recognize how the positive elements, the healing skills, the commitment to service, the ethics of protection, had shaped his son's character. "The hardest part about being here isn't the danger or the discomfort," the letter continued. "It's knowing that I may not get the chance to tell you that our last argument was my fault, not yours. You were trying to keep me safe because you love me, and I was too young and too stubborn to appreciate that gift. If something happens to me, I don't want you carrying guilt that belongs to me." Mama had risen from her resting place and approached the table, her massive head lowering until she could rest her chin near Silas's elbow. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly intended as comfort, that it broke through the emotional numbness that had protected him from the letter's full impact. Tears he'd been holding back for 5 years finally escaped, falling onto Jacob's careful handwriting and blurring words that had already rewritten his understanding of everything. "I need you to promise me something," Jacob's letter concluded. "If I don't make it home, don't let my death be the end of your story. You still have so much healing to do, so many people who need the gifts you have to offer. Mom will need you more than ever, and there will be others, maybe people you haven't even met yet, who will depend on the compassion and strength that make you who you are. Don't hide from the world because you couldn't save me. Save someone else instead." The prophetic nature of Jacob's final request took Silas with stunning clarity. His son, writing from a war zone with full knowledge of the dangers he faced, had somehow anticipated the exact circumstances that would define his father's future. The bears gathered around him weren't just wounded animals he'd happened to rescue. They were Jacob's final gift to him, a chance to fulfill his son's dying wish by saving someone else instead of drowning in guilt over the one person he couldn't save. Belle approached cautiously, her small body radiating the same empathetic awareness that had characterized Martha's response to emotional pain. She pressed against his free hand, offering the wordless comfort that transcended species boundaries. Charlie, following his sister's example, settled on the floor beside his chair, creating a circle of support that felt like family in the truest sense of the word. As Silas folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table beside his wedding ring, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the past 5 years. The isolation he'd embraced hadn't been healing. It had been a betrayal of everything Jacob had asked him to remember about his own capacity for love and service. The bear family that had wandered into his life wasn't a violation of wildlife law. It was a fulfillment of his son's final wish, a chance to honor Jacob's memory by continuing the work of healing and protection that had defined both their lives. The letter had rewritten his past, but more importantly, it had illuminated a path toward a future where love triumphed over loss, where purpose emerged from pain, and where the bonds of family could transcend the boundaries between species and the finality of death itself. Martha's hope chest sat in the corner of the bedroom, like a wooden monument to dreams deferred and promises kept. Silas hadn't opened it since the day after her funeral, when the simple act of seeing her carefully preserved mementos had threatened to shatter what remained of his composure. But Jacob's letter had changed everything, replacing the crushing weight of guilt with something far more complex, a sense of purpose that demanded he stop hiding from the past and start building toward a future. Inside the chest lay the archaeological record of a life fully lived. Their wedding album, Jacob's baby clothes, report cards and school photographs, ticket stubs from movies and concerts, pressed flowers from anniversary bouquets. Each item told part of the story of a family that had loved deeply and lost much, but whose legacy extended far beyond the tragedies that had ended it. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, lay Martha's original sketches. For the mountain cabin drawn with the optimistic precision of a woman who believed in building something lasting. The irony wasn't lost on him that the sanctuary she'd envisioned as a weekend retreat had become the setting for the most important decision of his remaining life. The wildlife officials would arrive within days. Henrik had warned him during his most recent visit. Sarah Chun's suspicions had finally coalesced into actionable intelligence, and the formal investigation that followed would leave no room for the gray areas where compassion and law intersected. "You've got maybe a week," Henrik had said, his weathered face reflecting the same moral complexity that kept Silas awake at night. "Sarah's a good woman, but she's got a job to do. Once she files her report, this becomes bigger than just you and those bears. Federal jurisdiction, mandatory relocation protocols, potential criminal charges. The whole machinery of government gets involved." The week had passed like a fevered dream of preparation and procrastination. Silas found himself simultaneously planning for separation and desperately seeking alternatives that might allow his unlikely family to remain together. He researched wildlife sanctuaries, contacted legal experts, even considered the possibility of fleeing to Canada with 3 grizzly bears, a plan so absurd that it made him question his own sanity. But it was Charlie and Belle's continued development that made any rational planning impossible. The cubs had reached an age where their natural instincts were beginning to assert themselves over their learned behaviors, creating a daily reminder that they belonged to the wild regardless of how domesticated they might appear. Charlie's playful wrestling had evolved into something that resembled actual fighting technique, his strength now sufficient to knock Silas off his feet during their rougher interactions. Belle's cautious exploration had expanded to include hunting behaviors, her patient stalking of mice and insects, suggesting that wilderness survival skills were emerging despite her protected upbringing. More troubling were the changes in Mama's behavior. The massive grizzly had begun exhibiting restlessness that spoke of seasonal cycles Silas couldn't override with warm shelter and regular meals. She would stand at the edge of their clearing for hours, gazing toward the higher peaks, with an expression that suggested she was hearing calls he couldn't detect. Her gifts had become less frequent, replaced by a distracted quality that reminded him of Martha during her final months, present in body but increasingly absent in spirit. The practical preparations for separation were heartbreaking in their necessity. Silas had gradually reduced the bears' dependence on human-provided food, encouraging them to forage for themselves and rewarding successful hunting attempts. He'd constructed a transition shelter farther from the cabin, slowly moving their sleeping arrangements toward independence. Most painful of all, he'd begun limiting his interactions with the cubs, forcing himself to ignore their confused attempts to maintain the close contact that had defined their relationship. The emotional preparations were far more difficult. 5 months of shared routines had created bonds that felt as real and permanent as any family connection he'd ever experienced. Watching Charlie's injured leg heal completely, seeing Belle grow from a frightened cub into a confident young bear, observing Mama's trust evolve from desperate necessity into genuine affection, all of it had filled spaces in his heart that he'd assumed were permanently empty. The phone call from Sarah. Chen came on a Tuesday morning when the mountain air carried the promise of spring thaw. Her voice held the professional courtesy that preceded difficult conversations, the careful tone of someone who understood the human cost of necessary decisions. "Silas, I need to schedule a formal visit," she said without preamble. "We've received reports about unusual wildlife activity in your area, and I'm required to conduct a thorough investigation. I'll be bringing a team from Fish and Wildlife Services, probably arriving Thursday morning. I wanted to give you advance notice out of respect for our friendship." The friendship she referenced was fragile and relatively recent, built on annual welfare checks and shared appreciation for the mountain's harsh beauty. But Silas understood the gift she was offering: 48 hours to prepare for whatever she might find. 48 hours to make choices that would define the rest of his life and the lives of the creatures who'd come to depend on him. "I appreciate the heads up," he replied, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "Anything specific you're looking for?" "Reports of habituated bears," she said carefully. "Animals that have lost their natural fear of humans, potentially dangerous to themselves and others. If such animals exist in your area, they'll need to be relocated or—" She paused, the unfinished sentence hanging between them like a blade. The alternative to relocation wasn't difficult to imagine. Bears that couldn't be safely returned to the wild faced euthanasia, a bureaucratic solution to the problem of animals that had learned to trust humans too completely. The possibility that his efforts to save Charlie and Belle might ultimately lead to their destruction added another layer of moral complexity to an already impossible situation. That evening, as he prepared what might be the family's final meal together, Silas found himself studying each bear with the intensity of someone trying to memorize faces before a long separation. Charlie's playful energy as he investigated every corner of the shelter, Belle's careful attention to his emotional state, Mama's protective positioning that kept both cubs within easy reach, all of it felt simultaneously precious and temporary. Like borrowed time that was rapidly running out, the decision crystallized slowly, emerging from the intersection of Jacob's letter, Martha's hope chest, and the undeniable reality of his love for these creatures who'd saved him from a living death. He couldn't keep them, that much was clear, but he could ensure that their future held possibility rather than captivity or worse. The solution would require courage he wasn't certain he possessed, and trust in a system that had already demonstrated its limitations. He began drafting a letter to Sarah Chun, explaining the circumstances that had led to his current situation and proposing an alternative to standard wildlife management protocols. The letter detailed the bears' medical history, their behavioral adaptations, and his assessment of their readiness for supervised return to the wild. More importantly, it included his formal application to serve as a wildlife rehabilitation specialist, using his medical training and demonstrated success with these particular animals to create a legal framework for what had begun as an act of spontaneous compassion. The proposal was audacious and probably doomed to failure, but it represented the first forward-looking decision Silas had made since Martha's death. Instead of simply reacting to circumstances beyond his control, he was actively shaping a future that honored both his love for the bear family and their need for appropriate long-term care. The hope chest lay open beside him as he wrote, its contents serving as reminders of all the dreams that had been realized despite seemingly impossible odds. Martha's sketches for the cabin had seemed laughably ambitious when she'd first drawn them, but determination and love had transformed those pencil lines into the refuge where he now sat. Perhaps the same combination could transform his current crisis into something resembling victory. As he sealed the letter that would determine their collective fate, Silas realized he was no longer the broken man who'd climbed this mountain 5 years ago, seeking only isolation and eventual peace. The bears had awakened parts of himself he'd thought were permanently lost. The healer, the protector, the man who believed that love could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Thursday morning approached with the inevitability of sunrise, carrying with it the officials who would decide whether his attempt to save a family would end in triumph or heartbreak. But for the first time in years, Silas faced the future with something approaching hope, armed with the knowledge that some battles were worth fighting regardless of their outcome. The transformation was complete. From a man hiding from life to one actively engaged in shaping it. From someone who'd given up on love to someone willing to risk everything for it. Jacob's final wish was being fulfilled in ways his son could never have anticipated. Through the healing of creatures who taught their rescuer that family could be found in the most unexpected places. Jacob's hunting rifle lay across Silas's lap as he sat on the cabin's front porch, its familiar weight serving as both comfort and symbol. He wasn't planning to use it. The weapon hadn't been loaded in years, but its presence represented everything he'd learned about protection and sacrifice during decades of loving people and animals who depended on him for their safety. The morning air carried the sound of approaching vehicles, multiple engines working hard against the steep mountain grade, bringing the reckoning he'd prepared for but dreaded. Sarah Chun's Forest Service truck led the convoy, followed by a white van marked with Fish and Wildlife Service logos and a third vehicle that probably carried additional personnel and specialized equipment. The sight of so many officials converging on his remote sanctuary felt like a military operation, which in many ways it was a carefully coordinated effort to enforce laws that didn't account for the complexities of love and loyalty that had developed between species. Mama sensed the approaching tension before the vehicles came into view. her massive body positioned protectively between the cubs and the source of unknown danger. Charlie and Belle huddled close to their mother, their usual playful energy replaced by the alert wariness that characterized wild animals facing potential threats. The family unit had consolidated into survival mode, ready to flee or fight depending on how the next few minutes unfolded. Silas rose slowly as the convoy reached his clearing, the rifle cradled casually in his arms in a way that suggested familiarity rather than threat. He'd worn his cleanest flannel shirt and his newest jeans, understanding that first impressions would matter enormously in the delicate negotiations ahead. The man greeting these officials needed to appear stable, rational, and competent, not the grief-stricken hermit they probably expected to find. Sarah emerged from the lead truck with the measured movements of someone approaching a potentially volatile situation. Behind her came two men in khaki uniforms, their expressions professionally neutral, but their body language suggesting they were prepared for anything from full cooperation to armed resistance. A fourth person, a woman with graying hair and the kind of practical clothing that marked her as a field scientist, completed the group. "Silas," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the clearing with careful authority. "I'm here with colleagues from Fish and Wildlife Services. We need to talk." "I've been expecting you," he replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Got coffee on if you're interested." The offer of hospitality was calculated a signal that he intended to approach this confrontation as a civilized discussion rather than a standoff. One of the federal agents visibly relaxed at the gesture, though his partner maintained the alert posture of someone who'd learned not to trust apparent cooperation. "We have reports of illegal wildlife harboring on this property," the senior agent said, consulting a tablet that probably contained detailed information about the investigation. "Specifically, allegations that you're keeping grizzly bears in captivity without proper permits or facilities." "The reports are accurate," Silas said simply, his honesty clearly surprising the officials who'd probably prepared for denials and legal maneuvering. "I've been caring for an injured female and her two cubs since October. They're healthy now, ready for supervised return to appropriate habitat." The admission changed the entire dynamic of the encounter. Sarah's expression shifted from official wariness to something approaching relief, while the federal agents exchanged glances that suggested they hadn't expected such straightforward cooperation. The scientist stepped forward, her interest clearly piqued by the possibility of observing human-bear interaction under controlled conditions. "Where are they now?" she asked, her tone reflecting professional curiosity rather than enforcement priorities. Silas gestured toward the tree line where Mama and the cubs remained partially concealed, their dark forms visible but not threatening. "About 50 yards. Out, watching us. The mother's protective but not aggressive. She understands I'm not going to let anything harm her babies." The scientist raised binoculars and spent several minutes observing the bear family, her quiet commentary to the federal agent suggesting she was noting behavioral details that supported Silas's claims about their health and disposition. When she lowered the glasses, her expression had shifted from skepticism to something approaching amazement. "They're magnificent," she said quietly, "and completely calm despite the presence of multiple strangers. That suggests an extraordinary level of trust and socialization." "They saved my life," Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Found them trapped after a tree fall, injured and dying. Helping them heal helped me heal. Now they need to go back where they belong, but not as captives or specimens. They deserve better than that." The federal agent consulted his tablet again, clearly working through protocols that didn't account for voluntary surrender and cooperative relocation. "Mr. Boone, what you've described constitutes multiple violations of federal wildlife protection statutes. The animals will need to be tranquilized and removed immediately for assessment and appropriate placement." "I understand your position," Silas replied, his grip tightening slightly on the rifle, not as threat, but as anchor to his resolve. "But I have a counter-proposal that serves everyone's interests better than standard enforcement procedures." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the letter he'd spent 2 days crafting, its contents representing either salvation or futile gesture, depending on how the next few minutes unfolded. The paper felt impossibly light in his weathered hands, but it carried the weight of every hope he'd dared to nurture since. Jacob's final message had rewritten his understanding of purpose and possibility. The photograph that would change everything was taken by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the wildlife scientist whose presence had initially seemed like another obstacle, but who now held a camera with trembling hands. The image captured a moment that defied every assumption about human-wildlife interaction. Silas kneeling in the snow beside Mama, his weathered hand gently examining Belle's healed ribs while Charlie pressed against his shoulder in a gesture of complete trust and affection. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Rodriguez whispered, her scientific training warring with the emotional impact of what she was witnessing. "I've studied human-bear interaction for 20 years, and I've never seen anything remotely like this level of mutual trust and affection." The letter Silas had presented to the federal agents lay open on the truck's hood, its contents sparking heated discussion among the officials who'd arrived expecting a simple enforcement action. His proposal to serve as a licensed wildlife rehabilitation specialist, using his medical training and demonstrated success with this particular bear family, had introduced complexities into what should have been a straightforward case of illegal wildlife possession. The precedent this could set is extremely problematic, Agent Morrison argued, his tablet displaying regulations that clearly prohibited private citizens from maintaining long-term contact with wild animals. "If we allow this arrangement, every amateur wildlife enthusiast will claim medical necessity and emotional bonding as justification for keeping dangerous predators." But Dr. Rodriguez's photographs and observational notes were building a compelling case for exception rather than enforcement. The bear's obvious health, their calm demeanor in the presence of strangers, and most importantly, their clear preparation for eventual independence suggested that Silas's care had achieved exactly what professional wildlife rehabilitation aimed to accomplish. "Look at their behavior," she insisted, reviewing images on her camera's display. "These animals haven't been domesticated. They've been healed. There's a crucial difference. They maintain their natural instincts while demonstrating learned trust in one specific human who's proven himself worthy of that trust." Sarah Chun had remained largely silent during the debate, her role as intermediary complicated by personal respect for Silas and professional obligation to wildlife protection protocols. But as the discussion continued, her expression shifted towards something that might have been advocacy rather than mere neutrality. "Silas has been living on this mountain for 5 years without a single incident involving wildlife," she said finally. "His medical background and demonstrated competence with these specific animals suggest he might be exactly the kind of person we should be working with rather than prosecuting." The breakthrough came when Agent Morrison's supervisor arrived via radio conference, his voice crackling through the truck's communication system as he reviewed the case details in real time. The federal bureaucracy that had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle began revealing unexpected flexibility when presented with documented evidence of successful rehabilitation and genuine expertise. "Dr. Rodriguez's assessment carries significant weight," the supervisor's voice announced. "If she's willing to recommend Mr. Boone for emergency rehabilitation specialist certification, we can authorize supervised transition under her oversight." The decision required extensive documentation, formal agreements, and bureaucratic procedures that would take hours to complete. But for the first time since the official's arrival, Silas dared to hope that his family might survive the encounter intact. The photograph Dr. Rodriguez had captured would become the centerpiece of his application file, visual proof that love and competence could transcend the boundaries between species. Mama seemed to understand that the tide had turned in their favor. She emerged from the tree line with her cubs, approaching the group of humans with the dignity of a diplomatic delegation. Charlie immediately gravitated toward Silas, his exuberant greeting drawing smiles from even the most skeptical officials. Belle maintained her characteristic caution, but her willingness to investigate these strangers suggested confidence in her human's ability to manage the situation. The transition will need to be gradual, Dr. Rodriguez explained as she documented the bear's behavior for her official report. We'll establish a protected area in the high country, where they can learn to live independently while maintaining minimal human contact. Mr. Boone will monitor their progress and provide intervention only if their survival is threatened. The arrangement wasn't perfect. It required Silas to accept government oversight of his relationship with the bears and impose restrictions on the contact that had become so precious to him. But it offered something he'd barely dared to hope for: a future where Charlie and Belle could live as wild bears while maintaining the connection that had saved them all. As the officials began the complex process of formalizing their agreement, Silas found himself thinking of Jacob's letter and Martha's hope chest, of the faith they both placed in his ability to heal and protect. The photograph Dr. Rodriguez had taken would become more than documentation. It would serve as proof that love could find ways to flourish even within the constraints of law and regulation. The new family photo represented not an ending but a transformation, the beginning of a chapter where healing and wildness could coexist, where the bonds forged in crisis could evolve into something sustainable and legally protected. For the first time in years, Silas was building toward a future rather than merely surviving the present, guided by the wisdom of those he'd loved and lost, supported by creatures who taught him that family could be found in the most unexpected places. The handmade bear carvings lined the mantel of Silas's cabin like wooden sentinels, each one capturing a different moment from the extraordinary year that had transformed his understanding of family, purpose, and hope. Carved during long winter evenings when the wind howled through the peaks and snow piled deep against the windows, they represented more than artistic expression. They were physical manifestations of love that had transcended species boundaries and redefined the meaning of home. 6 months had passed since the morning when federal agents and wildlife officials had arrived expecting enforcement and instead found themselves witnessing something unprecedented in the annals of human-animal interaction. The protected area established in the high country had become a model for wildlife rehabilitation programs across the region, drawing researchers and conservationists who sought to understand how such deep trust could develop between natural predators and their supposed prey. Silas's new role as a licensed wildlife rehabilitation specialist had brought structure and purpose to days that had once been measured only by survival and solitude. His remote cabin had become the headquarters for a small but growing program that combined medical intervention with behavioral rehabilitation, helping injured wildlife return to their natural habitats with skills intact and fear responses appropriately calibrated. The work suited him perfectly, drawing on decades of medical training while honoring the healing gifts that Jacob had recognized and Martha had encouraged. Each new patient, from injured eagles to orphaned elk calves, offered fresh challenges that kept his mind sharp and his hands busy. More importantly, the steady stream of creatures in need provided constant reminders that healing was possible, that broken things could be made whole again with patience and expertise. Charlie and Belle had thrived in their protected wilderness area, developing into magnificent examples of what wild bears could become when given proper care and gradual independence. Monthly monitoring visits allowed Silas to observe their progress from a respectful distance, watching as they mastered hunting techniques, established territory, and began displaying the confident behaviors that marked successful rehabilitation. Male had grown into a powerful young adult whose playful nature had evolved into the kind of intelligent problem-solving that characterized successful predators. Charlie had learned to fish with remarkable skill, his patient stalking of salmon in the high country streams proving that domestication hadn't compromised his natural instincts. More importantly, he developed appropriate caution around humans, maintaining the healthy fear that would keep him safe while retaining enough positive association to accept help if future injuries required intervention. Belle had become a thoughtful, careful bear whose cautious nature served her well in the challenging environment of the high peaks. Her hunting skills were perhaps even more refined than her brother's, her patient observation translating into remarkable success at finding food sources that other bears might overlook. The female's ability to read environmental cues and anticipate seasonal changes suggested she would thrive as an independent adult. Mama had perhaps made the most remarkable transition of all. The massive grizzly had resumed her role as a wild bear while maintaining an extraordinary relationship with the human who'd saved her family. During monitoring visits, she would occasionally approach within visual range, offering the same gift-giving behavior that had characterized their time together. Smooth stones, interesting pieces of wood, even flowers carefully selected and deliberately placed where Silas would find them. These offerings suggested that gratitude could persist across species boundaries long after the immediate need for help had passed. The cabin itself had been transformed from a refuge of isolation into a center of healing activity. Additional shelters housed temporary patients, while the main building served as both veterinary clinic and research station. Dr. Rodriguez visited regularly, documenting rehabilitation techniques and behavioral outcomes that were revolutionizing approaches to wildlife medicine. The remote location that had once symbolized withdrawal from life had become a beacon of hope for creatures who needed second chances. On this particular autumn morning, as Silas prepared for another monitoring visit to check on his bear family, he found himself reflecting on the chain of events that had led him from despair to purpose. Jacob's letter lay framed beside Martha's photograph on his desk, both serving as daily reminders that love could transcend death, that healing others was the truest path to healing oneself. The drive to the protected area took him through country that had become as familiar as his own backyard, past streams where Charlie had learned to fish and meadows where Belle had mastered the art of finding hidden berry patches. The landscape held memories now, stories of growth and learning that had unfolded under his careful observation. He found them near the waterfall where they'd first learned to hunt independently, all three bears healthy and content in the crisp morning air. Mama noticed his arrival first, rising from her resting place to acknowledge his presence with the dignified nod that had become their standard greeting. Charlie and Belle continued their foraging, secure in their mother's assessment that this particular human represented safety rather than threat. The observation took 2 hours, during which Silas documented their continued success and made notes about seasonal behavior changes that would inform future rehabilitation efforts. But the scientific work was secondary to the simple pleasure of seeing creatures he'd loved grow into their full potential as wild animals did as he prepared to leave. Mama approached the boundary of their agreed-upon interaction zone and placed a perfect pine cone at the edge of the trail, another gift, another expression of the gratitude that had motivated her to seek human help when her cubs needed saving. Silas accepted the offering with the same reverence he'd once reserved for Jacob's childhood treasures, understanding that some bonds transcended the boundaries between wild and domestic, temporary and permanent. The drive home took him past the cemetery where Martha and Jacob's memorial stones stood side by side, overlooking the valley they'd loved. He stopped, as he did after every monitoring visit, to share the day's observations with the family members, who taught him that love could find expression in the most unexpected ways. "They're doing well," he told them, his voice carrying across the peaceful landscape. Charlie's become quite the fisherman, and Belle's developing into a remarkable young female. Mama still sends her regards. I think she remembers how much you both loved watching wildlife from the cabin windows. The wind through the pine trees carried no answers, but Silas no longer needed them. The work continued, the healing expanded, and somewhere in the high country, a bear family thrived because one broken man had learned that saving others was the surest path to saving himself.